It was one of those peaceful days at the ranch, the kind where the quiet hums under your skin. The wind blew through the dry grass, the sound of an old porch step creaking with each step I took. It was the kind of quiet I was used to. The silence that clung to the place after years of hard work, the same silence that could feel almost unnatural. My 93-year-old mother, still as sharp as a hawk with bones like steel rods, had called me about some trouble with the fence. I figured it was probably just loose posts or a couple of coyotes, something small. What I didn't expect was what I walked into. I'd flown in just 3 days before, and the ranch had been still. But when I saw what was waiting for us on the front door, an unmarked envelope taped to it, damp from dew, no return address, no stamp, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. It wasn't just the envelope, it was what was inside. A grainy black and white photo of me walking along the fence line. No note, no warning, just surveillance. That's when I knew something was off. Something bigger was at play. Mom was sitting in her rocker when I pulled up. She handed me the envelope, looking almost tired. The letter inside was filled with legal jargon, phrases like non-compliance, unauthorized development, and my favorite, pending seizure. She didn't seem scared, but I could see her hands shaking as she passed it to me. "What is this, Mom?" I asked, barely containing my anger. "Some HOA group," she said, her voice steady but the tremor in her hands betraying her. "They keep changing their name, but now it's some rural zoning thing or something. They're circling." Of course, it was a new name for the same old tactics. Change the label, keep the power. It was clear as day to me now. This wasn't just about a goat shelter or fence posts, it was about control. They were trying to intimidate her, and if I didn't do something, they would succeed. That night, as I walked the perimeter, memories of my father flooded my mind. He used to walk this fence line with me when I was younger. Back then, it was all about checking for things like coyotes or loose posts, nothing sinister. But this time, I was looking for something else. I found boot prints near the back gate. They weren't ours, and they weren't made by any coyotes. These were heavy, deliberate steps, with deep treads. Someone had been watching us. I didn't tell Mom right away, not until I was sure of what was going on. The next morning, as I fixed a latch on the east shed, I heard the distinct sound of metal scraping metal. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate. I circled the barn, moving quietly, hand brushing the folding knife on my belt. And that's when I saw it, the padlock lying in the dirt, cut clean. It wasn't busted or pried, it had been snipped, cut with precision. Whoever had been there knew what they were doing. But they hadn't taken anything, everything was untouched. Still, something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, like someone had breathed where they didn't belong. I showed Mom the photo over coffee that morning, and she went still. "They're watching us," she said, her voice calm but with that hard edge I knew well. "Do you think they're bluffing?" I asked. She shook her head, eyes narrowing. "No. They're circling." At that moment, I knew things were only going to escalate from here. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not this land. Not my family. Not while I breathed. The following days were filled with tension, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes you watch your back. My nerves were a little on edge, but I stayed calm, keeping to my usual routine. But that night, 11:27 p.m., I saw something that made my blood run cold. From the second-floor window, I watched a black SUV crawl up the road. No plates, no lights. It parked just outside the gate, the engine running, not moving. I could feel the presence even from where I stood, but there was no sound, just the hum of an engine in the dark. It sat there for a full minute before it reversed and disappeared down the driveway. It was a strange feeling, like being hunted in your own home. But I wasn't going to show fear. The next day, though, I knew it wasn't over. Sure enough, the afternoon brought the second SUV, a big one that didn't wait to be noticed. It rolled up the driveway like it owned the place, kicking up dust in its wake. 3 figures stepped out, all in matching polos, cargo pants, and boots with a gleam that looked out of place on a ranch. One carried a clipboard, another wore a chest camera, and the third, who made my stomach turn, was holding a crowbar. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't even acknowledge the porch or the house. They spread out, one heading toward the barn, one toward the fence line, and the one with the crowbar took up a position near me. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward him, my hand brushing the blade of my folding knife. I was ready for whatever came next. He didn't say a word, but I wasn't waiting for him to. "You're trespassing," I told him, keeping my tone calm, but firm. The clipboard guy, who seemed to be in charge, called out from the other side. "We're authorized. Maple Ridge Expansion Zone compliance check." "No, you're not," I said, my voice cool. "Not in this county, you're not." Crowbar guy smirked, his eyes narrowing. "We go where the rules apply," he sneered. I smiled just a little, feeling my blood heat up. "See, that's your problem, you brought clipboard rules to a combat zone." His grip on the crowbar tightened just slightly, and I took another step toward him, watching his eyes flicker. He was testing me, waiting to see how far I would push. "You touch that barn again," I warned him, "I'll touch your trachea. Are we clear?" He didn't blink, and the camera guy flicked his lens in my direction, as if to remind me I was being recorded. "You're being filmed," he said. "Good," I replied, "I want the playback for court." Clipboard guy didn't seem too happy, but he pushed forward. "We have probable cause to inspect the structures," he said, his voice sounding more authoritative now. "Probable cause applies to cops," I retorted. "You 3 are dressed like mall security and pretending to be federal agents." Crowbar stepped forward then, moving a bit too fast, and I stayed still, waiting for him to make his move. He squared off with me, too wide, too obvious. It was a mistake, and I wasn't going to let him get any closer. "Too fast?" I asked, my voice low. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped even closer. I didn't move a muscle. The clock was ticking. This was it. I wasn't going to back down. And then, just as things were about to escalate, I heard it, a voice, calm and measured, but carrying the weight of authority. Mom stepped out of the house. She wasn't holding tea or a broom. She wasn't even holding a shovel. She was holding my father's old .222 rifle. It was unloaded, but they didn't know that. She didn't aim it at anyone, she didn't need to. She just leaned it against the post and said, "Get off my land." I could see the tension in their faces, the sudden realization that they'd underestimated her, and me. Without a word, they turned and left. No apologies. No retreat. They didn't fear us, but I knew they'd be back. They always come back, just like vultures circling. Later that night, I found something in the mailbox, a backdated county record, requesting property reclassification under a provisional occupancy voidance. In layman's terms, they were preparing to seize the ranch. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not while I was breathing. I looked across the valley, watching the lights of new development spread across the land. More people, more power, more pressure. But I made a promise to myself and to my mom, not this land. Not while I breathe. I didn't care who they were or what they thought. The fence they kept circling wasn't a boundary, it was a marker. A marker for their grave if they kept coming back. I could feel the storm building, and I wasn't about to let it break over us without a fight. It didn't take long for them to make their next move. One evening, I was sitting on the porch when I noticed the familiar rumble of an engine coming up the driveway. This time, it wasn't just a lone SUV. No, it was a convoy, a small one, but enough to make it clear they were ready for something more. 4 vehicles rolled up the driveway, engines growling like they meant business. The boots hit the ground in perfect synchrony, like they had rehearsed it all. At the center of it all was Karen, the woman who seemed to think she could bulldoze her way through anything and anyone. Her presence hit me like a wave of cold air. She was dressed in a polo, her sunglasses perched on her nose like a badge of authority, clipboard in hand as if it was a weapon. Behind her were more figures. Dozen or so people, all wearing matching compliance vests, some with tablets, others with tools. And, of course, one carried a crowbar. The tools were new, their intentions just as clear. They didn't knock. They didn't even look at the porch. They just fanned out, like they were staking their claim. One headed toward the fence, another toward the barn, and the one with the crowbar stood near me, his eyes never leaving mine. I wasn't in the mood for games. Stepping off the porch, I didn't rush. I walked toward the guy with the crowbar, my pace slow, deliberate. He didn't acknowledge me, but I wasn't waiting for him to. As I closed the gap, I spoke. "You're trespassing," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. Clipboard guy, always the one in charge, called out. "Per HOA Charter Section 14, this property is under full compliance re-inspection." I didn't hesitate. "No, it's not. Not under your authority." Karen, who had been overseeing it all, smiled, like she was explaining something to a child. "You're operating under outdated boundaries," she said. "The overlay was approved last quarter. We're not in your jurisdiction." Of course, she was lying. They had expanded illegally, but she wasn't going to admit that. No one with her attitude ever does. "I'll be the judge of that," I said, stepping closer, standing my ground. Behind her, someone pulled a drone from the back of a vehicle. It buzzed to life and took to the air, hovering like some kind of mechanical hornet, clearly surveying the land. I didn't take my eyes off Karen, though. She had been playing this game for too long, and now, she had pushed too far. I stepped off the porch, one deliberate step after another. "This is your last warning," I said. She didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of backing down. She was the type of person who only knew how to push harder when faced with resistance. But it was clear that she hadn't expected my next move. I moved toward her. Not fast, not reckless, but with purpose. I could see her jaw tighten, her fingers gripping her clipboard like she was trying to hold on to something, anything, that might give her control over this situation. "You want to inspect that barn," I said, "you'll have to walk through me." That's when it happened. The crowbar guy lunged. He was fast, but not fast enough. I sidestepped him, grabbing his wrist in a swift motion. With one twist, I threw him backward, slamming him into the porch post. His shoulder hit the wood with a sickening thud. The crowbar dropped to the dirt, forgotten. The second guy, bigger and built like a gym rat, came at me next. But I was ready. He came in high, with wide, untrained swings. I ducked, using my forearm to drive into his throat before sweeping his legs out from under him. He crumpled to the ground in a heap, gasping for air. Clipboard guy, the last one standing, tried to pivot and run toward the barn. But Mom, who had been watching from the porch, stuck out her cane, and the man went down, hard. He landed in a pile of goat droppings, looking like the world's most embarrassed security officer. Mom didn't even flinch. "Oops," she said, her voice dry as a desert. The camera guy, who had been filming everything, looked at me, his eyes wide in panic. "Still filming?" I asked him, knowing full well what kind of mess they had gotten themselves into. "Why yes," he stammered. "Good," I said. "Because this is your documentary on how not to seize a ranch." Karen, standing frozen, looked like she had just realized she'd walked into a hornet's nest. She turned pale as a ghost, her fingers clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. But I wasn't done with her yet. I walked up to her, calm but with a fire in my eyes. You think this is about barns and boundaries? I asked, my voice low and steady. You're trying to take legacy with paperwork and pretending it's legal. It's not. It's theft. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Mom stepped forward, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the original letter, the one that they had claimed we ignored. She dropped it at Karen's feet, letting it fall with a soft thud. Karen stared at the letter, her face contorting in disbelief. She had underestimated us, underestimated my mother, who had lived through more than most could imagine. But she wasn't backing down. You filed false claims, I said. You staged an unlicensed inspection. You brought tools onto a property you don't own. And now you're on camera with 2 injured team members and a trespassing charge. She finally spoke, but her voice was flat, hollow. You don't scare me, she said. I leaned in closer. I'm not trying to scare you, Karen, I said. I'm giving you the courtesy of a warning. Her face twitched, but she didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. She knew it was over. With her shoulders stiff, Karen turned and walked away, her team following her like lost puppies. They left, leaving the scene in silence, their defeat written all over their faces. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I knew this was far from over. The tension in the air didn't go away once they left. It hung there, thick and oppressive, like an unspoken challenge. Karen and her team might have left the property for now, but they hadn't given up. This wasn't just about a fence, or a barn, or even a goat shelter. It was about something bigger, something they were willing to fight for, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. That night, after they left, I sat at the kitchen table, going through the land records, zoning charts, and any digital files I could get my hands on. I knew I needed to gather everything, every piece of information that could help us defend what was rightfully ours. I had to be ready for their next move, because it was coming, I could feel it in my bones. As I dug deeper into the county records, something stood out. I found the name Marin Property Development LLC. It was a private shell company, no website, no contact number, no board, just a name and a handful of properties they owned. And they didn't just own any properties, they owned 5 parcels, with one of them being ours. Ours was listed as pending acquisition, not requested, not negotiated, just marked as pending. Like it was already a done deal. It was clear that Marin was up to something. They had been acquiring land quietly for the past 2 years, all without public notice. Our ranch, smack in the center of this so-called luxury redevelopment zone, was the last piece of the puzzle. And that's when I realized it wasn't about the fence violations. It wasn't about the barn. It was about ownership. They wanted our land, and they had the means to take it. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the anger that was rising inside me. They thought they could intimidate us, break us with paperwork and legal threats. But they hadn't counted on my mom. They hadn't counted on me. I knew what I had to do. I called a couple of people I trusted. One was a land use attorney in Denver, and the other was a former FBI fraud analyst who specialized in real estate crimes. Both of them replied the same day, and both said the same thing: this is bigger than a crooked HOA. You're dealing with organized asset acquisition. Corporate land grabs. They're using shell companies to buy up land cheap, claim it's underdeveloped, and then res-zone it before anyone knows what's happening. That was when I knew we were in deeper than I initially realized. This wasn't just a local issue. This was a coordinated effort by powerful people who thought they could bulldoze their way through anyone in their path. But they hadn't counted on the fact that we weren't just some old rancher and her son. We weren't going to back down. Not this time. Mom found me later that night, buried in documents, exhausted. She quietly brought me coffee, and we sat together in silence for a while. Then, she spoke up, her voice soft but firm. He told you, didn't he? She asked, her eyes on the window, staring at something beyond it, lost in thought. If anyone tries to take it, make them dig. I nodded. She was right. Dad had always said that. He'd never given up on the land, and neither would I. The next day, I went back to the records, gathering everything I could find: county permits, zoning meeting minutes, tax histories, business filings. I had everything lined up, ready to fight. But what I didn't expect was the speed with which they responded. By the end of the week, I walked into the zoning board hearing, and it felt like I was walking into a courtroom. The gymnasium was packed, but the temperature was cold, as if the people in the room knew something I didn't. On one side of the room sat Karen, flanked by two suits, one woman with a wheeled briefcase and glasses that looked like they belonged in a Netflix legal drama. They were calm. Too calm. They thought they had it in the bag. The meeting began with the usual agenda items: potholes, park benches, a bake sale proposal, but I wasn't interested in any of that. When it was time to talk about land use reevaluation, I stood up, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on me. I wasn't here to play nice. I wasn't here to back down. I handed over a USB drive to the clerk, and when they plugged it into the system, I took the floor. I went through every piece of evidence I had. First, the property tax records, up to date, no liens. Then, our historical charter from 1957, filed long before any HOA existed in the area. I showed them emails between Marin Development and two HOA board members discussing rezoning, holdouts, and land grabs. I laid it all out for them, from shell company ownership to the shady financial dealings between Marin and the HOA. The room grew quieter with every slide. I could feel Karen's frustration building as her lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. They hadn't counted on this. They hadn't expected someone to actually do their homework. This isn't about goats, or barn inspections, or keeping the county pretty, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. This is about forcing families off their land so someone else can come in and build a paradise. They don't want us here because we're in the way. I sat down, letting the truth hang in the air. Karen, trying to recover, stood up and pulled out a red folder. She opened it and pointed at me. "This man does not legally own the property," she said, her voice smooth, calculated. She had her ace up her sleeve, a document showing that the original deed holder was my father, Dale Whitaker, who had passed away. The room held its breath. But I didn't falter. I couldn't. Not now. Karen thought she had me cornered. Her smirk was so tight, so confident. She was certain she had won. After all, without the deed, I couldn't claim ownership, right? But the room was still buzzing with uncertainty, and I wasn't about to let her win without a fight. The judge, an old friend of my father's, had been quietly watching the back and forth, but he wasn't making any moves yet. Karen's lawyer stood up, trying to seize the moment. "There's no will on record," he said, his voice smooth. "No deed of transfer. Under Colorado's dormancy clause, if there's no clear living legal owner, the land can be reassigned. This land is up for grabs." I felt that old rush of panic rise in my chest, but I shoved it down. I had prepared for this. I had known they would try this angle. I turned to the judge, my face steady, my voice cold. "I have no intention of letting you take what's not yours," I said. "But if you want to talk about deeds, let's talk about the one my father left behind." The room fell silent as everyone turned toward me. Karen's smug expression wavered just for a second, but she quickly recovered. My father had been a stubborn man, but he was meticulous about some things, especially when it came to his legacy. I turned to my lawyer, who stood up with a small folder in his hands. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge directly, "I'd like to submit evidence of a notarized property transfer deed, a certified copy of the original land patent, and a letter from Dale Whitaker himself, dated and filed 3 months before his passing, but never submitted." The room was stunned into silence. The tension in the air was thick. Karen's lawyer glanced nervously at his client, and I saw her jaw twitch as she processed what was happening. I walked over to the clerk and handed them the documents, watching as the judge examined them carefully. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge read the letter, the transfer deed, and the land patent, all signed, witnessed, and properly executed, but never filed. "Everything's in order," the judge said, his voice heavy with finality. "The property was transferred before Mr. Whitaker passed. The deed and patent are legal. You, Mr. Whitaker, are the rightful owner." The weight of the words settled over me, but it wasn't over yet. I had been expecting this fight, but now it was time to finish it. Karen was starting to crack. I could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers clenched around the red folder, like she was trying to hold on to some shred of control. But it was slipping away. Fast. She didn't say a word. Instead, her lawyer tried another tactic, standing and raising his voice. "Your Honor, we challenge the validity of the deed on the grounds that it wasn't filed within the statutory window. The transfer is void." But I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I stood, turning to the judge with a calm resolve. "Your Honor, I conducted an independent occupancy survey 60 days after my father's passing. The county registrar stamped it, filed it, and acknowledged it. It was recognized. This challenge has no merit." I turned to the surveyor I had hired, a tough, reliable guy who had been part of the investigation from the start. He handed the judge the stamped documents, showing the proof of occupancy. Karen's lawyer was caught off guard, and for the first time, Karen's cool exterior cracked. The judge looked at the evidence. "This acknowledgement means your challenge fails," he said. "The law is satisfied. The Whitakers are the rightful owners of this land." Karen's face was pale. Her lawyer leaned in and whispered something in her ear, but she didn't answer. The entire courtroom seemed to shrink, and it was clear Karen had lost control. But then she tried something else. A last-ditch attempt to salvage whatever she could. "I want the property reassessed," Karen demanded. "Under the HOA's expansion rights, we can't have this land remaining as it is. It needs to be rezoned." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested in her maneuver. "Miss Whitaker," he said, turning to my mother. "Do you have any interest in Marion development?" Mom stood slowly, her voice low and steady. "This land was never dormant," she said, her eyes meeting Karen's with unwavering resolve. "My husband walked it every day until he died. And my son has kept it alive ever since." Karen muttered something under her breath. It was a weak attempt to regain control. She couldn't fight what was clearly in front of her. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitaker," the judge said, turning his gaze toward her. "This land belongs to the Whitaker family, permanently. The court recognizes the deed. The board's actions are nullified. All further enforcement attempts are blocked, effective immediately." The gavel slammed down with finality, and Karen was done. Her smirk was gone. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't say another word. She stood up slowly, collecting her things, the red folder still clutched in her hand. She looked straight ahead, not sparing a glance at any of us, and walked out of the courtroom, her team trailing behind her like defeated soldiers. I looked at Mom, who was standing next to me, her face still calm but with a slight smile playing at the edges of her lips. She hadn't said a word during the hearing, but I knew she was just as relieved as I was. The ranch was safe. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't just disappear. She would regroup, rebrand, and try again. They always did. As we left the courthouse, I turned to my mother. "You think that's the last of it?" I asked. Mom looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "No," she said. "But you better dig in." And that's exactly what I did. I wasn't going to just protect this land. I was going to make sure they never had a chance to take it again.